So we're going to be in our next segment, which is Before Lunch. And I'm JP Fennell, so I'm a senior director at SAP. And this is my 5th forum. My first forum was actually at the Penn Museum before we found a home here at the Sugar Casino. I guess it's our 3rd year here. And actually the closing keynote at that forum was our SAP CIO at the time, Mike Goals. And just to show you how much things have changed, how in demand this next topic is Mike now is spending so much time meeting CIO to CIO, how SAP secures SAP, that he is now leading a booming consulting practice within SAP, consulting full-time to CIOs who really need to lock down and secure and build that trust we talked about this morning around digital transformations. So, by the way, I'd like to echo Scott Snyder's remarks this morning about the importance of being ahead of the trends. It was 12 years ago when I co-founded Mobile Monday here in Philadelphia. We grew out to about 2,000 members, and that's now the Philly New Tech Meetup. I saw Brad Denenberg and Chuck Sacco outside, so it's good to see the thriving community here in Philadelphia. And I just would like to thank Scott for his thought leadership. It's now my pleasure to introduce our moderator, Tim Coates. So Tim is the US head of blockchain at Synchronon, based out of New York, and where he was instrumental in developing Synchronon's utility and insurance blockchain accelerators. And prior to that, Tim was a senior consultant at EY, so I also have Big Four DNA. And he received his bachelor's and master's degrees from, I'll let you guess where from, but it's not in the US. And ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome Tim Coates.
Thanks, JP. Thank you. And thank you all for joining. I want to introduce the panelists and get you guys to come up on stage. All of us at once. We have Debjani, Jess, Ken, and Alexander. They'll introduce themselves. Blockchain has come a long way since its origins. 10 years ago was when Bitcoin came to prominence, and subsequently, people are in the camp of crypto or in the camp of appropriating that technology for enterprise use and a lot of operational efficiencies that can come from that. In the last few years, there's been a lot of technical progress around privacy and scalability and a lot of other non-functional things. We maybe haven't seen the great progress on the application side, and so there aren't a huge amount of applications out there that are in use, in production, adding value today. And so we're going to explore a bit about that today with this panel. I want to first let them introduce themselves, because this panel can all give their own perspectives from their own organizations. And hopefully I can move to the next slide. Yeah, I can. So Jess, would you like to introduce yourself and what you guys at MasterCard are doing?
Sure, thank you. Hi, I'm Jess Turner. I am the EVP of Digital Payments and Labs in North America, and I also lead a global issuer engagement digital product team as well. And what that means is that I'm accountable for all of the digital platforms in the US and also globally with some of our largest customers. I'm going to spend a minute just talking about what MasterCard's doing in the digital landscape overall, and then I'll tie that back to blockchain. So MasterCard's very focused on digitizing all transactions and providing services before and after a transaction to help make the world a better place. And what that means is we have multiple platforms. One is one all of you may know us for, which is a card-based platform, MasterCard. Others are a P2P platform called Send. Another one is faster ACH, real-time payments. We have that platform as well. And the last one I'll touch on is blockchain. We have a blockchain that we've built ourselves. And what we've done is we've built a private blockchain, and then what we've done is we've built applications on top of it so that we can use our blockchain to do multiple different things. And we're still in the pilot phase, but what we're really focused on is how do we help big worldly problems so that we can help consumers and businesses move product or services around the world, including cross-border, more quickly. And so that's really where we focused our applications. We've also been focusing on this idea of MasterCard has been completing transactions and also have held people's trust around the world for years. So how can we use blockchain to do that for things that fall far outside of payments? And that's in a nutshell what we're focused on, and I think we'll talk more about that later.
All right, Ken, do you want to go for it?
Hi, good morning, everybody. My name is Ken Nessel. I work for Pfizer. Just as in terms of some background on Pfizer, Pfizer is a global pharmaceutical company based in New York, but with a large site not too far from here in Collegeville, Pennsylvania. We have about 780 million people around the world on our medicines and vaccines. We spend about $8 billion a year on our R&D pipeline, trying to develop medicines that will change the lives of patients and improve their lives. I am the lead for our blockchain strategy and execution team. This is basically a center of excellence around blockchain at Pfizer, and I'm a member of our digital solutions and emerging technology team. We've created a blockchain center of excellence because when you look at any list of the top industries that could be impacted by blockchain or benefit from its innovation, healthcare is always on that list, usually at the top, within the top 3. That's for 2 reasons. One, we spend a lot of money, as a country on healthcare. About 20% of the U.S. GDP is spent on healthcare. And 2, because a lot of that money goes to waste. By some estimates, for every $1 spent on healthcare, 30 cents of that, goes to waste, due to a lot of issues around trust, which we'll get into further. From my company's perspective and in our sector of healthcare, which is pharmaceuticals and life sciences, we see opportunity areas for us in supply chain, clinical trials, health data exchange, and finance and contracting. And I'll elaborate on those as we go through the panel.
Johnny?
Hi, I'm Debjani Mohanty. I'm a blockchain expert. I got around 18 years of industry experience, and currently I'm working as a freelancer. I'm a blockchain solution architect. I'm author to 3 of books that are already on Amazon, Blockchain from Concept to Execution, which is already published by Asia's biggest tech publisher, BPB, and been translated to German and Chinese. Also, I'm author to Ethereum for Architects and Developers and R3 Coda for Architects and Developers. I work as an advisor to quite a few organizations in and around in India as well as abroad, in Sydney and in Switzerland and in Kerala in India. So 3 of my products which I have architected are already in production. There are blockchain solutions. The one which I take most pride in showcasing is something I did for Instimatch Global in Switzerland. So this is a solution where it's for money market intraday solution, which first time globally we have implemented. No one has done it before. So this is a solution which we did through blockchain and marrying these 2 concepts of blockchain and using R3 Coda and Ripple as a cryptocurrency. So the settlement, which usually used to take T+1 days or T+2 days in Europe or anywhere in the world, we have made it as quick as 5 seconds using our approach. So this has cut down the settlement time and the cost up to 60%. So that is my approach. And also I'm working as a mentor to quite a few universities in India. And my mission is to not only to work, but also to take it to people who would be greatly benefited through implementation of blockchain technology in their organization. Thank you.
Thank you. And then Alec.
Hi, my name is Alec Rifkind. I'm CEO and founder of Sigma Ledger. We focus on the counterfeit prevention and supply chain transparency. So practically, when we started doing that, and we started from counterfeit prevention and end-to-end traceability, we realized those 2 are just 2 sides of the same coin. And if we connect everybody in the supply chain and do full end-to-end traceability, including consumer, so in different industries, it would have a different name. You probably heard the term like from farm to table or from factory to shelf. In pharma, it's usually called track and trace. Formal, it's called like provenance, lineage. Like different industry would use different name. But practically, if you address that and you also include a consumer, you get pretty powerful platform to do a lot of interesting things, including counterfeit prevention. So you can block many counterfeit cases, which which existing technology just incapable of doing. And in general, currently, the war on the counterfeit is very inefficient because it's growing. It's just today, the counterfeit market is like more than $1 trillion, and it was just under $1 trillion 2 years ago. So it's just constantly growing. And of course, nobody's happy about that. But it's more than just a counterfeit. Many more things you can do if you put together this traceability and full lineage. And most importantly is efficient recalls. Again, many cases about how retailers or brands cannot do this in time and surgically enough to minimize their cost. Usually it's very expensive and long time. So the blockchain as a technology actually removes some obstacles why it couldn't be done before, mostly because members didn't trust each other. And we'll get to that.
We will get to that.
topic.
The theme of this session is trust. I think ever since the 1700s with Adam Smith and division of labor, every business has always had to rely on interaction with other businesses and exposes themselves to another firm to do them wrong. And so, as you can see on the screen there, we manage that risk today in a whole bunch of different ways that come with costs and friction, and there are whole departments in companies that exist to manage the risk of counterparties doing you wrong. Blockchain is seen as an opportunity to create a trustless technology because it is decentralized. We're not trusting a central actor, we're writing directly onto it. That is a combination of its immutable shared data structures, the shared business logic or smart contracts that basically allow you to know that what you see is what your counterparty sees and to build programmatic relationships between two different firms. Every different industry will approach that problem differently. And so with this panel, we're particularly interested in seeing how in each of these different sectors, they approach trust and managing trust and how blockchain can help reduce the friction of their business models. So I'm going to jump at the person looking at me the most intensely, which is Jess. And Jess can kick us off with sort of how MasterCard thinks about trust and in particular in your use cases.
Absolutely. So trust has been at the heart of our business forever. That's really what we stand for. Consumers and businesses trust us to take something very near and dear to their heart, which is money, and move it to someone else. And so blockchain is a natural progression for us, and that's why we've been focused on it and why we've built one. Like I said, we right now have built a permission-based blockchain because most of the customers that we serve and where we sit in the ecosystem are entities that need that for their business. And the reason for that is if you're thinking about banking and cross-border and moving data into other places with regulation and just security requirements, permission-based blockchain is an easier way to do that. The other part of our philosophy around trust is, privacy is in our architecture for everything we do. And when we built our blockchain and when we build these different applications that we're doing today, which is proof of provenance and some cross-border, more auditing services versus payment, the reason we do that and the way we architect that is that we take the least amount of information and hash it as possible. One, it creates efficiencies, but more, it gives people trust. If you take the least amount of data for what you're using that application for in blockchain, people trust you, both your businesses and others connecting to it when it's permission-based. And so for us, trust is at the center of our brand. It's the center of what we do, and blockchain's another extension for how we can serve our customers and the ecosystem.
Perfect. And so Ken, I want to move to you. Pfizer and MasterCard, obviously the two institutions at the table. So obviously firms that have absorbed trust for many, many years. So interesting to get your perspective, and then we'll move to sort of the counter side.
Yeah. I'll start just talking about supply chain, build a little bit on what Oleg was saying, because I think in our sector, in healthcare, it has sort of a special meaning because counterfeits in the supply chain for pharmaceutical products are not just a business problem; it's a public safety problem. There's 1 million people a year globally who die from taking counterfeit medicines. So it's led to an interesting set of circumstances which are fueling a lot of discussion around blockchain as a solution for supply chain. And blockchain for supply chain is all over, like all industries are examining that. But in our case, a special circumstance exists where, because of the public safety risk, the government is acting. And there's a law that's been on the books since 2013 called the Drug Supply Chain Security Act, which basically requires industry to create a system to track and trace pharmaceutical products through the supply chain to ensure public safety. So track and trace, we start talking, as soon as you hear those words, you start thinking about blockchain. And so the industry is thinking about blockchain, and a lot of just different consortium are forming together to examine that use case. it's not exclusively a blockchain use case, as most aren't, and there are other possible solutions, so it's not like a for sure that that's the way we're going to go, but we're very actively examining that one. One other that I wanted to sort of highlight as well is in the space of clinical trials. I think one of the things that I've learned in examining use cases, through the lens of Pfizer is, you have to think not just about like the value of the use case, but also like how much market influence you have as a company to bring that use case into reality. Because in many cases, you're one of many players on a team, and you don't have that much influence to actually make things happen. Supply chain is kind of like that because the market is largely dominated by 3 wholesalers. But anyhow, so on the clinical supply side, it's different. Our clinical trial side, it's different. Pfizer runs many clinical trials, and when we run clinical trials, there are multiple parties involved. There's CEOs and clinical sites and labs, so you've got multiple parties transacting, but we're the sponsor of the clinical trial. So we have a lot of influence into what approaches are taken. And these trials are dogged by a lot of the problems of trust that you were describing, Tim, about multiple parties transacting, the need for like really strong security and audit trails, because this is a heavily regulated process. And if you collect data and you do it in a way that doesn't capture patient consent and other things that are required by a study protocol, you can't use that data. So talk about like an inefficiency or a source of friction. That's a big one for us. So we're examining in that space use cases around capturing the e-consent or consents onto a blockchain, tracking our pharmaceutical supply chain, which is different from our commercial supply chain, also an interesting use case, as well as biospecimen tracking. Biospecimens get collected in the course of clinical trials, and they travel this like circuitous path through all these different labs, and we lose visibility and tracking of them in that course, and we need to know what happened to them in order to complete our study report. So some really interesting use cases in there, and I'll other examples as well, but I'll pause there.
I think it's fascinating about a few points you said there around influence in particular, and the trust that I just described then, trust is a source of power for a lot of institutions as well. So if you look at like Amazon, anyone that sells anything at Amazon has to expose their business model to his platform owner. If you look at iPhone, anyone that wants to run an app on the iPhone has to expose themselves and their business model to the fact that Apple/iPhone can systematically discriminate against their business model in favor of themselves, for example. So particularly for the institutions here, do you have challenges in your own organization saying, well, we want to decentralize things when we are the current central actor in that workflow? Do people ask you, are you crazy? Like, why would you want to do this? Either one?
Yeah.
I mean, people ask me if I'm crazy often, but not for this. The answer, I think, is the technology is enabling an audit in a traceable, allowing us to audit and do things in a traceable and more efficient, quicker, and a convenient way. In a lot of areas, we haven't been able to solve for it in a different way from MasterCard's perspective. This cross-border example I gave you is a great example of that. So we can move money very quickly anywhere, but all the steps in between that of knowing where the money came from, what's the FX rate, did we do KYC, is it going according to regulation, that's really hard. And if blockchain can help us do that more quickly, even if we move the payment differently, but we can settle that way, it's solving a real world problem that helps people. So no, I don't think we're asked if we're crazy, and we're not trying to decentralize anything. We're trying to use the technology to make things better.
I think it's a very fair question, and we don't talk about decentralizing ourselves very much, but we do talk about decentralizing other people and removing other like intermediaries from the system, and that's complicated and very loaded. So much I won't talk about it in detail today, but those questions come up. If there's an intermediary in a process, is there a way that some action that could be taken to eliminate them from the value chain? But today, those people are our partners. So talking about eliminating them from the value chain is generally not very good for a partnership. So you've got to like walk a thin line there and be circumspect about how you do that. But like for example, in the case of like patient health data, that's a case where there is a whole big decentralization play that's possible. I mean, today all your health data is largely owned not by you, but by the provider that like saw you last, and it's in their medical record and maintained by that provider network. There's a play around, and blockchain is central to this, around decentralizing that and making you the owner of your own patient data. And Pfizer would think that was great, because today we buy data from data brokers and other people who are anonymizing your data and selling them to us without, with some questionable practices about like how much consent you provided to that process. That whole business model is under pressure. So, so we are actively evaluating those things, even though we're buyers of that data today.
Yeah, so I love that use case where blockchain is sort of the only way to start solving that problem. It's not a comparison of different technologies. Only one technology gives people private keys to act directly themselves. Debjani, Jess mentioned cross-border payments, a place that you're particularly interested in as well with XRP and Corda and the work you've done there, I think in Switzerland. Do you want to talk to why cross-border payments has a unique trust issue as well?
Okay, yeah, I think I'll talk about the whole use case that I was referring before. So this is money market intraday. So money market is a little different market from capital market. I think most of you must have heard of capital markets where people invest for a long time. In money market, people invest for a very short while. It could be as low as few hours, and it could be as high as 364 days. If you go to Wiki, that is what it says. The maximum time is 364 days. So this is between different banks and financial institutes. So they come together in a single platform, and they borrow or lend with each other. Anyone can be a borrower. Any of the banks can be a borrower. Any of the banks can be a lender. And intraday is a special case where a bank needs, let's say, $2 million US for 4 hours. Okay, so in that kind of scenario, there was no solution before, because usually in the traditional approach, the settlement takes T+1 days or T+2 days anywhere in the world. So that is a typical scenario that we had, for which we had used blockchain. First of all, we had to decentralize it. There was an existing solution on a traditional database. So there was a centralized system, and all the banks were working together. But then gradually they thought of introducing blockchain, because if you decentralize it, there is no single point of failure, and also the data is totally added in append-only mode. That is the basic feature of blockchain. Now, so that any of the banks, if they update the data, the others can see. Okay, so that is what it's offering you, that immutability. The second thing is, how would you do the settlement? Because in intraday, let's say bank A is saying that, okay, I need $2 million US. So, and it's choosing bank C, D, and E out of 50 banks, because we have already onboarded 50 banks. It's choosing just 3 of these banks and saying that send me your codes. Now, these banks B, C, and D, they are sending their codes. And bank A is choosing one of them, let's say bank B, and saying that, okay, the deal is finalized. Now what will happen, that bank B would send that kind of money to bank A. But how come that would be possible? And that too, only for 4 hours. How that is possible? We have used Ripple. Ripple is a cryptocurrency especially meant, Ripple uses XRP as a cryptocurrency in its backend. And they can do this kind of money transfer within 5 seconds. So within 5 seconds, bank B would transfer that money to bank A, and bank A would be using it, and after 4 hours, as per the smart contracts, it could be 4 hours, it could be 2 hours, whatever it is, but within the same day, bank A would come back with the same money, it would return the same money along with some interest, and that would again happen within 5 seconds. So this kind of possibility is not there. And also, all these banks, these 50 banks, are not restricted to Switzerland. They are from different parts of Europe, and we are also trying to include more banks from Middle East. So they offer it in different kind of different kind of currencies. It could be Swiss franc, it could be some GBP, it could be something else. Yep. So all these things are facilitated by uses of Ripple. Yep. This solution.
It's in the US we call intraday liquidity as repos for large dealers, and it's a fascinating story that the banks are trying to solve there, where in tri-party repo deals, so there's a third party that sits in the middle of that transaction to manage the settlement risk. It's Bank of New York Mellon in the US. They have a monopoly. And it's basically because no one else wants to do it, because they get exposed to settlement risk for about 20 minutes on an intraday trade. It could be a 3-hour trade, but about 20 minutes Bank of New York Mellon is exposed. When the financial crisis happened in 2008, they went, no way I'm taking that risk of a multi-billion-dollar trade, take 20-minute settlement risk, and Bear Stearns is going down, Lehman Brothers, so they withdrew from the market, and so it becomes a systemic risk that there is a central actor that can withdraw the fact that banks want to do intraday liquidity to each other. So again, quite a unique example of why blockchain specifically solves a problem that central databases will never solve. Alec, go for it. How does
Okay,
trust impact the
so
world?
yeah, supply chain is very different. To some extent, they're different. But so first of all, of course, there is not that much regulator activity. Of course, there is an FDA, for example, and FDA comes with a requirement for track and trace, but it's very simple to satisfy. So that's a good and a bad thing at the same time. Bad thing is because you cannot, in many cases, you cannot rely on regulator keeping an eye on somebody else. So it's not like in the banking industry, for example, or in medical industry and healthcare, where there's the regulator collecting all the data, trying to flag when there is a discrepancy or a mismatch. So you can't rely on that. And of course, the same trust issue exists with the data in supply chain. Of course, ideally, everybody wants the traceability. There's a lot of a desire to be able to collect all the data from manufacturer, raw materials provider, suppliers, from distributor, from retailers, from whole house warehouses, to collect all that, connect it, and provide holistic view on the supply chain like overall, and ideally connect a consumer. But there's a big pushback because somebody has to operate a system, right? And then you have to give up your data to somebody. So one way of doing that, of course, is to elect some independent, disengaged third-party operator. That's a lot of trust, and nobody is going to watch.
And particularly with supply chain, this is cross-border often, and it's the same problem with cross-border payments. Who are you going to trust cross-border?
Absolutely. So that's one thing. The other thing is that, of course, you want to provide all the data also to consumer. A lot of brands now realize that a much better way of proving to consumer that your products are good is not just getting this organic certification, which getting less and less trust from a consumer, but instead give them more transparency. You would know which farm it was grown, what exactly pesticides were used, how it went through the supply chain, and so on. But how would you guarantee, how would you get this trust for a consumer to that data? So one way is to actually say, I'm a good brand, you have to trust me, which is not very promising, especially consumers today are very skeptical about pretty much every brand. Another way is to use a technology like a blockchain to say, because blockchain gives you immutable data which you can't tamper with without everybody else noticing that. So if you say, every member of the supply chain puts its data on a blockchain, and you can go there and look at it, and you can be sure that nobody changed the data, or if it did, you see it. That's another trust.
So I find supply chain use cases quite interesting because blockchain is just a technology. It's not magic. So there is still an issue of garbage in, garbage out.
Of course.
If someone puts fraudulent data on the blockchain and it's there permanently forever and I can never delete it, that's a bad thing. So particularly in Pfizer, is probably a similar story. Like, how do you guys think about addressing that issue? You have to sort of manage the trust on the onboarding of data as well.
So
you go for it first.
Yeah, so first, if you collect in the supply chain, because it's always a chain, there is a node, somebody puts the data in, and next person takes it over and puts next data in. There's a way actually to check what the data has to match. That's one thing. Another thing is also, at some point, if you figure out that the reality is different, you can also trace back to the node which introduced that discrepancy, and actually much easier to do all this investigative work, of course, but you can't eliminate the human factor completely, of course, never.
Yeah, I would just add that one of the criteria that evaluation criteria that we apply to use cases is the, do good data standards exist for the data you'd want to put on the blockchain? Because you need that, right? Because that's the garbage in, garbage out kind of thing. But that makes actually supply chain pretty appealing because there are good data standards. There's the GS1 data standards and others. So that's like so it checks a box for a high value use case, and supply chain checks a box.
Perfect. And then I just want to return back to the cross-border payment / intraday liquidity. So today in the financial system, you have Nostro-Vostro accounts, and you have correspondent banks, right? And so these exist as sort of clunky ways to deal with the fact that cross-border is difficult. Who's going to regulate? Can US and Europe agree that like Switzerland's the global hub for payments, and so just do everything through there. They can't. Interested in exploring, like, how do, is that typically the business case around a cross-border use case?
So this is a very interesting thing that in news just a month back. So world over, how the remittances happen, intercountry money transfer, how that happened today is mostly through SWIFT. SWIFT is a network which joins some 10 to 11,000 banks across the world. And the money transfer usually takes, it used to take up to days, 5 to 7 days, from 2 to 5 days and maximum 7 days. But now they have come up with the new feature called GPI, and that has reduced the time to almost 30 minutes. Okay, but with this kind of network, what you need is Nostro and Vostro accounts, which most of you might have heard of. But the problem with this account is the banks have to give a minimum amount in the Nostro accounts. Okay, so today, because there could be any liquid issue, because you are doing a transfer in some other currency. Now today, world over, there are some $3 trillion US worth money is there in Nostro and Vostro accounts, which are just wasted. They're just sitting over there idle. Okay, that money could be invested elsewhere. So maybe we need XRP or something similar. I don't know. Maybe something else would come. Maybe tomorrow Stellar would be more popular. I don't know. But maybe if we use this kind of cryptocurrency or maybe stable coins, which we might be discussing later on, we can get rid of all this wastage that we are doing today.
Yeah.
So just a little bit of a counter view on that. So cross-border payments has continued to be complex, and it will be an opportunity. And SWIFT has a decent size of the market. I wouldn't say the lion's share, because it's still fragmented in many corridors. And when I talked before about different solutions, I think you have to break apart what the issues are for cross-border payments or remittances and who the use cases are on the other side. And that's why I think you need multiple platforms for different reasons. Real-time payments have taken off in a really fast way. Regulation is coming together in a different place than we've ever seen. And rich sources of data, even through other platforms, are at a different level than we've ever seen, with trajectory of it getting better much faster. What blockchain can do in parallel to those things, and where some of these other organizations frankly can't, they can be distributors of it, they can be endpoints of it, is if you can, with a permission-based environment, and that's part of the trust issue, connect different entities around the world without heavy lifting internally and without redesigning their systems, you can do data exchange quickly, even if the underlying payment is done in a different way. And then you do have this center place of audit. So I just say that because blockchain's not going to solve for everything. I don't believe they're going to solve for releasing tons of funds into the economy anytime near term. What it will do, though, it will make things faster, user experience better, and it will make remittances something that more entities are willing to do in a different way.
It might be something you can't talk about, but MasterCard's view around JPM coin, XRP, these different bridge currencies that can, well, XRP being a bridge currency, JPM coin, to be determined what that's really about. You guys' position on whether that's a feasible path forward?
So our position is this. We believe in any currencies that make money movement better, but with full KYC and identification on both sides and some level of volatility control is interesting. We have not seen a lot of that in the marketplace. We haven't seen that be able to happen to date.
Yep.
But anything where you don't know who's on both sides of it, there's no identification,
Yep.
and the volatility is damaging to the overall good of the economy is hard to support.
Okay.
And that's interesting because cryptocurrency originally was meant to be anonymous.
Exactly.
But that's not what the banking or regulators want. Right?
Yep. And do you want to talk to XRP and that as a bridge currency?
Well, XRP, as I said, today there are 10 to 11,000 banks across the world which are connected through SWIFT network, whereas XRP connects only 400 to 500 banks so far. So I think banks are still kind of two minds whether to go ahead with XRP. But in my case, I'm currently involved in 2 projects in Switzerland, and both of them are using XRP. And that was one of my questions. This is quite interesting here. This was my question to the client, my first client, that what if the other party doesn't return the money? Okay, so because XRP is a separate network, right? You are just connecting to it. It's your ways. You do not want to pay back that money in time. And he said that, no, we got strong regulation in the country, so that is why this would not happen. So that kind of trust is there. So I think it's not only this product that we are building, but again, how the law and order are there in the country, that also is really needed.
Yeah, it's a really difficult challenge to solve. So nice analogy that I like to think of for XRP versus JPM coin recently and others. Problem we're trying to solve is a bit like Vegas and casinos. So you want to be able to have a chip that works at every casino. And what JPM coin is just a chip that works at JPM, which is not particularly interesting. So it's a chip that works at one casino. If we can solve the challenge of a chip that works at every casino, every bank, and XRP is trying to do that, there are other efforts underway to try to do that, basically a coin that has utility for all. But there are just so many trust issues to resolve while you're going through that. So that is what a lot of banks are dedicating a lot of time to. And then if we can solve that, then settlements for securities and other things start to become very interesting. Okay, I want to move to the next agenda topic, which is around building business networks. So a big reason why these blockchain networks are not live today, or not many of them are, is because we often, building ecosystems from scratch is difficult. It's a bit of a chicken and egg problem. For example, if I issued a security into a network where only 5 actors were in it, there's clearly going to be a liquidity premium on that security because in the old way of doing things, there are thousands of firms that could buy it, and then so it's harder to subsequently on-sell that security. That same story can work for any use case, supply chain, medical, otherwise. If you don't have both sides, the value often dissipates for a blockchain network. So we have this challenge of trying to get that adoption. Incumbents will probably, and the established institutions have an advantage in that they have existing customers and brand, and others will approach it more bottom up. But I think this panel will be an interesting set of perspectives on that. So maybe Ken, as the incumbent or as an existing player in this market, how do you guys think about building that network?
Yeah, I mean, if somebody asked me what are like the top 3 things that are impeding progress towards more production blockchains, I would say building the business network, building the business network, and building the business network. I mean, it really is the rate limiting factor. I think the technology is good enough for us to have more production blockchains than what we have. I mean, it needs to improve, and it will, but it's good enough. The problem is really a human and organizational problem, which is the problem of getting an ecosystem together to agree to the terms to share infrastructure. Because blockchain is a team sport, and when you're in an ecosystem with other parties, and you're all running your node, and you're collectively doing this sort of decentralized record keeping, that's shared infrastructure. And as soon as you have shared infrastructure, you need shared governance.
Yeah.
You need to start making decisions about what legal form does this governance body take, who has decision rights, who are the members, what's the business model. Those are all like really hard questions to answer, and the questions that you're answering with a group of people who are typically your competitors, in that ecosystem. So I always feel that to drive to alignment on that is like a very high level skill. Like if you can do that, and like your next job should be negotiating Brexit or like NAFTA, because you're like you're in the elite like multinational negotiating team crew. So really hard to do, and I think. It's just taking time. Yeah. It's a slog, honestly. Yeah. But we think the juice is worth the squeeze, so to speak. So we're in a lot of these consortium, and and see a common purpose. We just have to bring that common purpose through this process and to the other side.
Yeah. Jess, do you want to go for it?
I have to say, I can say what he said again and say it differently, but I pretty much totally agree. So I think. For what we're using it for, at least, figuring out what the underlying ongoing management and governance of it is the biggest part, which is why that's why we're piloting and prototyping in the 2 areas we are. They're areas we know. They're with people we work with, even with proof of provenance and the way we're doing it, and we're connecting to partners that frankly aren't really our competitors. So we're in a little bit of a different environment, and we're just trying to add value, right? So counterfeiting and things. It's still in our wheelhouse because we sell things, we're behind the scenes. But I completely agree, so I'll give someone else.
I think one other layer on top of it, though, having most of the consulting we do is for large banks. And it's not just that competitive issue, but layer on top of that the fact that there are about 10 different departments of that bank that you need to agree to it. Like IT security is a nightmare on this stuff. It's a multiplier of, let's say, 20 banks being involved, and then 10 departments in those banks, and then 10 people within each of those departments, and getting their agreement all at the same pace. Very difficult. Alec, do you want to go for it?
Well, I will not repeat, I agree with everything that was said, but I will not repeat that. I will try to add that from our experience, there is one killing argument how you can convince business to adopt some new technology. That's a promise of savings. And in the supply chain, there is often the case. So we are usually talking about removing intermediary and a lot of savings. We are talking about sometimes removing some clearinghouses, which takes like big portion of money, is surprisingly big, unnecessarily big. Yeah. Just replacing that intermediary. And the only reason he is there is because those 2 and 3 parties don't trust each other. So everything those mediators are doing is just reconciling the data and saying, hey, this is the kind of my arbitrage on what you have, what you owe to each other. Yep. So replacing that with a technology can be like a 10 times savings.
And all those intermediaries, right, the real test of truth is like how much value do they add along the way when they take that clip of the ticket. And so that's obviously the challenge.
Right. The other thing is that it's important to find a way you apply your force, right? So there must be the right driver, because it's bringing multiple businesses together for that to bring in value. It's not enough to sell to one company. You have to sell to 5 at the same time, or at least to 2. Yeah. And in some industries, we found it easier to come from brand. Brand usually have a lot of influence. And then at certain saturation point, the new players just start coming on board. For example, in CPG, we start from big brand manufacturer, then they're starting bringing like small retailers on board because they can kind of push retailers, small retailers, but big retailers, they cannot push that because that's usually the opposite. As soon as enough smaller retailers are on board, the big retailer is coming on board as well. So that's definitely the smart way of navigating through the landscape of businesses to find the proper point of application.
I would agree. The one thing I would say is if you want to work with big entities, the forward-looking entities that do have a group that's focused on it, so you can do these kind of proof of concepts early on in a very safe way where you're not trying to take over and then move on, is also how we found ourselves to be successful, which is typically separate than all of those layers of people you've talked to. They're kind of...
And I think the big guys tend to feel an onus to lead the next generation of whatever it is in the space, whereas the little guys are still trying to catch up to the big guys. So we see tends to be the number one guy in a space that really wants to push something. Deb, so just before I move to Deb, we'll probably have a little bit of time for questions as well, so feel free to trigger those up. Deb, same question. You guys talked to having about 50 banks involved in that XRP quarter solution, so could you talk to how you bring them along and incentivize them?
So we must learn that we are talking about Switzerland. Switzerland is one of the foremost countries who have adopted blockchain like anything. So in that case, I mean, in my experience is a little different. We didn't have to push those people to come on the same platform, on a blockchain platform. They were already working on a traditional approach. Now they are moving to the blockchain approach. So that was not an issue at all. The other one is I'm involved in some government projects in Kerala, in southern India. So in India, most of the states are actually very keen to move to blockchain-based solutions. So in Kerala, we are doing it for passport, passport applications, where there are multiple offices involved. Like passport is one office, police station is one office, and there might be a criminal data office. So all these are actually falling under the state government. And Indian government is very keen, especially by our PM, Mr. Modi, we are very keen in blockchain adoption. So if the state is, state government is really keen, then you cannot, the individual offices cannot say no to it. So that is why I didn't find any friction in that area.
Yeah. Okay. And then one other thing I wanted to touch then, and particularly on the guys involved in supply chain type use cases, there's sometimes a misalignment or a sort of uneven set of incentives to a supply chain story. So it's really the end seller that cares about being able to prove that this wasn't a blood diamond or whatever, or it didn't come from slave labor, which is the part of the provenance story that we tell. So particularly interested to how do you compel someone who is just someone in the middle of that supply chain who, for them it's not as significant?
Well, for us, that's where we have an advantage in the pharmaceutical supply chain because they have to care. It's the law, and they do care because it'd be immoral not to, because of the threat to patient safety. So, we don't have an issue around trying to sort of compel wholesalers or dispensers to care about counterfeit medicines. They get it. They're on it. Yeah.
That's a good, yep.
There is no unfortunate generic answer to that. In some cases, there's a lot of influence. Actually, small guys are at the risk of losing their business if they're not complying. In many cases, brands or manufacturers or retailers have a lot of influence, and depending on who they are.
And you see Walmart being very
Walmart just have influence over everybody, or Amazon. They just say you have to do it, otherwise you're losing business, and everybody is doing that.
That's the problem with centralization, is they can demand that. And
the competition also works, right? Because this is what happens. If brands start to provide this transparency to consumers, that gives them a competitive advantage on the actually end users. So people start buying from them and not from somebody else, and then everybody else is starting to catch up. Otherwise, they're losing business.
I want to give the opportunity. We've got about 5 minutes left for the audience to ask any questions. I don't know if there's a mic. There is a mic at the back, and there's a question over there.
Hey, good morning. My name is Dwight DeVera. Actually, I work in drug supply chain security. So one of the big challenges, besides the drug supply chain in the US having been interoperable in just a few years, is there are at least 5 major blockchain initiatives. And there probably won't, in just what we've seen, there's probably not going to be one blockchain that rules it all. So can you guys comment on blockchain interoperability, even though it doesn't exist?
Great question.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just chime in first. That's like a worry that I have personally because I just feel that there's so many of these consortia sort of springing up to solve the problem. You can't participate in all of them, but you don't want to be left out of any of them. So it does create like a taxing effect on the resources that you have available in any company. And I kind of worry that as we kind of, there's this whole like FOMO, fear of missing out sort of thing going on here where like you end up getting involved in all of them because you don't want to miss out on the opportunity to influence any of them. And then you end up not being able to make like a full contribution to any of them because you're spread so thin. I do think though that we're not headed towards like a single solution, and this most of the industry, I think supply chain or beyond, sort of sees the future of blockchain as being a network of networks, kind of like the internet is, and that interoperability that doesn't exist in a great degree now, but it's going to have to be a feature of the future because that's just what the future is going to demand. And generally, I feel like any problem that has like that's a technological problem will have a solution. The human ones I'm more worried about having a solution, but the technological ones, the market will move and fix the shortcomings. Others?
Anyone else?
I'm not sure. This is one of the scenarios which can happen, is this blockchain of blockchains. But I don't think we have enough confidence in that scenario. There are other scenarios which can also happen. There will be more than one blockchain, definitely, but they will be not necessarily compatible, and there will be not necessarily a network over networks. That can happen, but what also can happen is people will have tools to work with multiple blockchains, not actually knowing which blockchain it is. So that will be abstracted, but it will not be integrated.
Yeah.
And this is like my personal kind of expectation, that's more likely to happen, mostly because blockchains are changing towards the way how they handle data. Mostly different blockchains will care data differently, and it will not be only about if data is on this blockchain and on that blockchain. In many cases, data will be in the off-chain. Those off-chain will not be ever integrated, and to get to that off-chain with the blockchain, the way how it is distributed between blockchain and off-chain will be very different in a different network, conceptually different. Otherwise, those will simply compete and only one survive.
Yep.
So there are many scenarios, like several of these scenarios that can happen.
Yeah.
But I'm not saying that one not going to happen. It's just there is a probability for that and for another one.
Yeah. I'll guys have a go. Interoperability.
Me?
I'll go.
Okay.
Yeah, if you want.
So the question comes to my mind that why we need a blockchain interoperability. Can you tell me a use case where we need two blockchains to work together? I mean, I haven't come across with that kind of situation so far. But if at all we find that kind of situation, I think it's perfectly fine because most of the blockchains like R3 Corda, they work on they expose their services through REST services, right? So even I think Hyperledger Fabric, they also do something similar. So integrating those solutions together, it's not at all a problem, like what he said. So it's only the human part that is more concerned.
I think in finance, it's hugely important. So like, let's take a securities issuance. People subsequently use that security as collateral in a repo trade. Well, then those two networks need to talk to each other. If they can't talk to each other, then that security that we traded has less value because it can't be used for repos or intraday liquidity. So it is absolutely critical they talk to each other. The solution, one way to do it is to have a big monolithic blockchain that has everything in it. But I mean, maximize the human problem we just talked about by 1,000, trying to achieve that.
I can give an example of the use case. And that happens today as well, but maybe that happens because it's still getting mature, and maybe eventually it will disappear. So there's a thing called blockchain as a service today already. So when company creates some platform, actually it's rather blockchain as a platform, not only as a service like BAAP. And you can come over and just create your solution and put on an existing platform on blockchain. IBM is in this service, like Ethereum is in this business. And sometimes when some business come and say, I want to put something on your blockchain because I like the functionality you provide me, but then I don't have enough trust in your network. So I want my data to be not only on your network, but for example, also on Ethereum or also on IBM. And that's where those blockchains might want to create the bridge, or sort of saying, okay, it's not only here but there, and the data is guaranteed not only by my blockchain, which you don't have enough trust in, but also by public Hyperledger, which you have a lot of trust.
And that's the side chain concept that you described,
absolutely.
right? So yeah.
And they will keep appearing, of course, always.
One more question there, go for it.
This is Mani, and I have a little bit of experience in financial services industry. So the first point is, coming to the use case, what Debjani was saying, the money market, as part of moving the cash between banks, we are talking about a collateral which is not guaranteed by anybody. Putting a cryptocurrency as an underlying collateral, by the time it moves from hand to hand, it may fall 100% or 50%, we don't even know. And I'm literally surprised, how did we had that as a collateral for a money market which is moving as a hard cash, moving between banks for that period, number one. Number two, two questions are first one is the backbone of the blockchain is the cryptography. What is the kind of thought process in terms of security as we move forward using blockchain as a whole for all of our transactions between the counterparties? Number one. Number two, going from public and private, obviously we have two separate things. These contracts are between two counterparties. How much of arbitration law which is guaranteeing? Because if I write a note on a bonded paper, that is definitely valid. How much of the arbitration holds true between these contracts, which is digital?
Yep.
So I won't agree that cryptocurrency is the base of every blockchain application. Cryptology, okay, fine.
Yeah.
All right. So yeah, collateral is an issue. That was my question to my client, that if there is no collateral involved, that is, how do you make sure that the person is actually paying back the money? But he said that this is Switzerland, so I mean, this falls under very strong regulation, so you don't have to worry about that part.
Yep.
Sorry, the second question, what was that? How the contract is valid. The contract is actually pre-built. So this is agreed by all the parties. We are including that contract inside the application when everyone agrees that this is what our business rules are, and let it get into this kind of contracts, and then only everybody is agreeing to it, and it's part of the application. So it's not that it happens in the last moment and somebody is coming up with something, some negotiation.
Does court honor? That's the question. Is it legal when I get into that contract if I don't honor?
Yeah. So I think this is the difference between digital tokens and tokenization versus native cryptocurrencies. Is digital tokens rely on real world as well. Like if I fail to pay, the real legal system is going to step in. It's not just code is law. It's law is law, and that's what Bitcoin got wrong so many times. You just cannot defraud someone just because you did it on a blockchain. So I think it's a very, very good question, and I think it's something anyone involved in tokenization should be thinking about all the time. Anyone else sort of apply that to your use cases?
We are not mostly dealing with money. We are dealing with
more data.
But the way the contract usually is honored on a blockchain, this is actually a very powerful concept we haven't touched, and it's very interesting. It's a smart contract thing. Is that nobody actually asks you; it just happens. That's the point, right? Because when in the physical world is like, hey, I did what I was supposed to do, now you have to pay me, for example, or you have to do something. That's not going to happen. It's just if the contracts say, the smart contracts say that you have to pay, and the event is product is shipped or delivered, system just executes payment. And nobody going to come to you and say, hey, you have to pay. No, the money just goes. And then if you disagree, then it means you wrote the wrong contract or you entered in the wrong agreement. So that's pretty powerful concept, but it's just controlled by robots. You're not going into court with that.
Yeah. Someone in the back stop me if I'm going over time. I have no idea.
We also aren't using blockchain for payments, and we're a payment company. We're using it for the other aspects, and again, prototyping in, partially because I don't know how many people are payment geeks, but the actual payment piece is actually works. It's a technology that works. And to us, blockchain is a technology that can help with certain use cases and won't for others. And my goal, maybe this is confrontational here, but my goal is not to make blockchain the next world's biggest success. It's to figure out how blockchain is going to help my business move forward. And so we're using it for different aspects. Very honestly, MasterCard's early days on any kind of public blockchain, ours is very tight.
Okay, so we will conclude there. I think that's a really good point to conclude on, which is basically blockchain needs to be the easiest way to solve a problem. You can't just use it for the sake of it. It does get you budget early days, but eventually that'll fall flat. Sanjay's laughing. He hired me for that reason once. So we'll thank you very much for your time, for listening to us, and thanks to the panel for participating. And please reach out to us afterwards. Any questions? Thank you. Thank you.